Alright, SBI3U. I'm going to stop adding numbers to these because you all know what number it is. You clicked on it, right? So this is the respiratory system note. Here's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about a respiratory system overview. We'll talk about the structures in the lung. We'll talk about some terms for inhaling and exhaling and lung volume and stuff. And then just a basic overview of some disorders of the respiratory system. This is a pretty quick note, so should be a relatively speedy video, but as usual I'm going to talk about things in a bit more detail. So let's get started with a respiratory system overview, just an overview of the respiratory system. First off, why? Why do we have to breathe? Why do we have to breathe in? Why do we have to breathe out? There's actually two reasons for this. Number one, we need to break down our food, and the last step in breaking down our food is basically making a bunch of this ATP stuff. So ADP and phosphate get together and they make ATP. This is really a grade 12 chemistry concept, or grade 12 biology concept. So just wait till grade 12 biology and you can learn all about that. But one of the main things here is most of the ATP that we make is made in our mitochondria. And our mitochondria, the way that they make the ATP is they shuffle electrons around, and oxygen is very good at pulling electrons. So the oxygen is used to grab the electrons at the end of this chain in the mitochondria and then take those electrons away so that more electrons can come into the chain. So that's oxygen's role. It's used in our mitochondria to squeeze out as much ATP as possible for every glucose or other molecules that we use for energy. The other thing is that we are constantly making carbon dioxide. It's a byproduct of the sugar thing. It's actually made in a different part of the mitochondria from the oxygen, so or a different chemical reaction than the oxygen in the same part of the mitochondria. This oxygen isn't actually that same oxygen. It's not like that oxygen ends up on the carbon dioxide, but we still need to breathe out the carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide in water is acidic. It creates carbonic acid. It's the same kind of acid that's in like soda that makes the soda taste sour. If we have a buildup of CO2 in our blood gets acidic, and we don't want acidic blood. So the reflex to breathe out and breathe in a new batch of oxygen is actually triggered by the acidity of the carbon dioxide in our breath, rather than the need for more oxygen. You've probably seen videos of people holding their breath for like 5 minutes or 7 minutes or whatever. That's because they can kind of ignore their carbon dioxide signal, but the oxygen levels are pretty okay during that time. I'll find a video of that and I'll put it down here. I'm sure there's a video of someone holding their breath for a long time while attached to an oxygen meter. I'll try to find one. All right, that's the need to breathe. Oxygen in, CO2 out. Some system interaction stuff. We're always interested in how different systems interact with each other and connect to each other. The respiratory system brings in the oxygen. That oxygen is used absolutely everywhere. Every cell that has mitochondria needs oxygen. Every cell that has mitochondria is generating CO2. So that circulatory system needs to provide all of the oxygen and take away all of the CO2 from the whole body. But it's just up here. It's just in the lungs. So the circulatory system is obviously incredibly important to bring the CO2 to the lungs to get taken out and to bring the oxygen from the lungs out to everything. That's why the heart is right next to the lungs, so that we can have that gas exchange happen as efficiently as possible. Obviously the lungs are cells. They're made up of cells, so they need energy as well. So they get sugar and other things from the blood. They're also supported by muscles. So if you look at the keep in mind up here, the lungs don't have muscles of their own. They are supported by the muscles around the rib cage and the muscles, the diaphragm, the muscle at the bottom of the thoracic cavity. So muscular system, obviously important. I just talked about the rib cage, which is part of the skeletal system. So that's important. The digestive system makes the nutrients that the lungs are going to use. Well, digest the nutrients that the lungs are going to use. You know, it's all related. Yeah. And the nervous system controls our breathing rate. So that's the next piece here, control. The nervous system will control it. It's controlled mostly by brainstem type stuff, which is down low. We do all of our thinking up here. And then like emotions are over here, basically. And then down here is all of the automatic processes. Heart rate is also controlled down here in the pons and medulla. The breathing rate is also controlled there. So we have this kind of automatic breathing pattern that we can fall into. We don't really have to think about it. This is why people that are unconscious or sleeping, they can still breathe, but people with serious brain damage need to be on ventilators because if they have damage serious enough to affect the brainstem, then they're not going to be able to breathe. Higher brain functions can override this. You can switch over to manual breathing. You can take manual control of your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles and stuff and just start breathing on your own. That's fine. Eventually you'll just fall back into the automatic pattern when your brain gets bored with that and gets distracted. You can even override the reflex to take a breath for a certain amount of time, like holding the breath. As the CO2 builds up, you get more and more of a signal that you need to take a breath, but with enough mental effort, you can actually override it. Here's an overview of it. Everything's obviously connected to the mouth and the nose. Sometimes it freaks people out just how big their nasal passages are. Just think about that, like how far back that goes, right? It goes like all the way back to basically like behind the cheek, right? Think about like the ear would be around here. So it's kind of like your nasal passages are very, 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 very long. And since I'm making this video because of coronavirus social distancing, look up videos of coronavirus tests. The nasal swab, they go way in there. So you get an idea of just how far your sinuses reach. Then there's tubes that branch into more and more and more tubes. And then the actual lungs themselves, which we'll talk about that structure, how it makes efficient gas exchange. So that's where we're going to start. The lungs are the major organ, obviously. The sinuses, these guys, all I'm going to talk about the sinuses is that you have this big sinus cavity is thought to warm up the air and make it more humid as it comes into the lungs, because the lungs are very delicate, and you want them to have warm, moist air because the lungs are warm and moist. There's hair and mucus in your nose. It tries to trap dust and sweep it out, and then if enough particles get in there, you sneeze. So I'm sure we've all sneezed in a dusty room before. One other interesting note here is that the right lung is bigger than the left lung. This is because the heart is in this hollow area, and the left side of the heart is bigger than the right side of the heart, because that's where the left ventricle is. That's where the big, thick, muscular wall that's going to shove the blood up into the rest of the body is. So the right lung is actually bigger than the left lung. Now we're going to go organ by organ, so I'm going to pause and do this stuff. Okay, we're back. We're into structures of the lung. We'll start right from where we left off with the esophagus going down the back of the throat. There's the epiglottis, that little flap that opens up when it's time to take a breath and closes up when food is coming down. The larynx is the part of it, the first part of it that's going to lead air down into the lungs. Larynx for lungs is the easy way to remember it. It's also sometimes called the voice box because the vocal cords sit right there at the top of the larynx. Here's an illustration of the vocal cords as they open and close. there's little muscles on each side that pull those strings tighter or less tight. And these two things are like little flaps. And as the air goes through the flaps, you end up making different pitches. So to kind of simulate it, you can kind of do a stupid thing where you blow air through your lips and blow a raspberry, right? If you tighten up your lips, you'll get a higher pitched version of that. So, right, it's basically equivalent to what your vocal cords are doing. They're flapping like that. A lot of video of vocal cords stroboscopy down below, as a lady is has a camera pointed at her vocal cords, and she goes through her range of pitches, and you'll see the muscles tightening those cords, and they're vibrating faster and faster and faster and faster. Really cool video. It also looks like some kind of crazy alien mouth thing when it's in operation, because every time you take a breath, it suddenly opens up and then goes right back to what it was doing before. Yeah. So that's the vocal cords. That's the whole larynx. After the larynx, it moves into the trachea. You see the trachea coming off down here. There's the trachea. Trachea is in front. It's the very front one. You can feel your trachea if you just poke at your neck right in the front. It's this cartilage covered structure, because if you look at keep in mind, only air is supposed to go through these structures, so they're relatively delicate. So this thing is surrounded by this really tough cartilage to protect it from impacts. The other thing the trachea has is it has little hairs, and it's full of mucus, and so the mucus and the hairs work together to try to trap particles, and then the cilia brings them up to the top of the throat, and if there's enough particles and enough mucus up there, you will cough and expel the mucus and the particles that are up on top. This is, when people have respiratory diseases, a lot of them end up affecting the mucus in the cilia, especially by making lots of mucus. So, yeah. Moving down, the trachea is just one tube. It has to branch into two. Tubes. Those are called the bronchi. And here's the branch. So one's going to go to the left lung, one's going to go to the right lung. And then inside the branch, there's even more branches. Like that branch is going to go off into different branches. Those little branches are called bronchioles. At the end of the bronchioles are these little sacs called alveoli. So the bronchi are the two tubes. Everything past that is a bronchiole. This is where asthma happens. It's the bronchi. The bronchi can open and close in response to inflammation and stuff like that, and they can also make lots of mucus in response to inflammation. And asthma is a problem with that sequence of events, where they'll start getting inflamed, and then they'll kind of go through a feedback loop where they get more and more and more inflamed. There's a video here. I'll have that link to that video in the description down below. Here's a micrograph, an electron micrograph of the mucus and the cilia. The bronchi also have mucus and cilia. This is normal bronchi, and the cilia really are like little hairs that sweep particles out of the bronchi and bronchioles. And in someone with respiratory troubles, a lot of the time this mucus is just much thicker. The mucus layer is much thicker, which impedes the airflow. Now that all ends in the alveoli. There are millions of these little alveoli, 150 million per lung. So you have lots and lots of them, and they're little tiny air sacs. So at the end, it's a dead end, and they are little sacs. So they're hollow little sacs, but they're tiny, very, very small, micrometers in diameter. So, 1,000th of a millimeter. Those alveoli are wrapped up like a fork wrapped in spaghetti. They're wrapped up in capillaries. these capillaries here. And as the capillaries flow past, there's a lot of CO2 in the capillary and not a lot in the alveolus. And there's a lot of oxygen in the alveolus and not a lot in the blood. So the CO2 comes out and the oxygen comes in. This doesn't take very long, and it's not a complete exchange. A lot of people think that we pull in all of the oxygen and we breathe out all the CO2, but it's not a complete exchange. The air is 21% oxygen. When we breathe out, it's about 16% oxygen. So we've only exchanged about a quarter of the oxygen content of the air as we breathe out. This is why, rescue breaths and CPR actually work. And yeah, basically that 4% ends up being replaced with the CO2. The 4 or 5% of the oxygen that we pull out gets replaced by CO2. So when we breathe in, it's something like 0.04% CO2. And when we breathe out, it's like 4% CO2. We're increasing the CO2 by quite a lot. It's just basic diffusion, right? When there's a lot on one side and a little bit on the other, they'll move this way. When there's a lot on one side, a little bit on the other, they'll move this way. And these are capillaries. They're very thin. Blood cells have to go through single file. The alveoli also have a very thin membrane, also one cell, so that the diffusion can happen very easily. And this also makes them incredibly delicate. So the alveoli, these little tiny air sacs, they have to be kind of puffed up in order to exchange gas, because if this closes off, it's like when you try to blow air into one of those long balloons that are made for balloon animals and things. It's very, very hard to blow into it when it's collapsed, and that's what happens when a lung collapses. That oxygen ends up on hemoglobin. We've already talked about that in our circulatory system thing. The CO2, interestingly enough, in your blood is mostly carried not by the blood cells, but by a molecule called bicarbonate. It's actually dissolved as bicarbonate ions in your blood. Most of it. Some of it's on the hemoglobin, some of it's just dissolved as CO2, but most of it's in bicarbonate form. Next we're going to get into breathing and ventilation, so we're going to pause for a sec, and okay, we're back, and we're talking about breathing and ventilation. I'm going to move my stuff over to the other side here, so you can read these a bit better. There's two parts to ventilation. It's inhalation and exhalation. Breathe in, breathe out. It's all about pressure differences between the air on the outside and the pressure in your lungs. When I just sit here and just sit here for a second and not say anything with an open mouth, air doesn't really move forwards and backwards because the pressure inside my lungs is equal to the pressure outside my lungs. When I want to breathe out, I need to make more pressure in here than there is outside. When I want to breathe in, I want to make less pressure in here than there is outside. I can't really change the outside air pressure, but I can change my internal pressure to suit. There's two muscles involved. There's the diaphragm and there's the intercostal muscles. The diaphragm is the one that you use most of the time. Most of the time when someone's breathing, their torso barely moves. It's just a diaphragm. The diaphragm sits kind of there, just under the rib cage. It's beneath the lungs, and it can kind of flex up. Flexes. It's the main muscle of breathing, and when it flexes, you expel, and when it relaxes, you can breathe in. So most of the time you're using the diaphragm, but if you ever see someone that's really, really winded, really needs a lot of oxygen to the lungs, or has some kind of issue, they'll be using their intercostal muscles, and the intercostal muscles are on the outside and the inside of the rib cage. The ones on the outside will lift the rib cage up. That's what happens when you push up your chest, kind of, kind of. They like raise it up. And the internal ones will push it down. So when someone's like really winded, you get this like you get like a rib cage motion at the same time as you get the diaphragm motion. So inhalation. Diaphragm will. Oh, I have my diaphragm backwards. Let me turn this around. The diaphragm will actually when it contracts. When the diaphragm contracts, it pulls itself down, and it makes a bigger volume inside yourself. And at the same time, the outside muscles will also contract, so your rib cage comes up, making a bigger space inside. So it's a bigger space inside, but with the same amount of air, which means that the pressure has to go down. And the air will just flow in by itself because now there's a pressure difference between the outside and the inside of your lungs. Yeah, and the lungs will expand to fit that pressure. I'll add a link to like a breathing demo down below. There's a simple one you can do with just a balloon and a pop can. Yeah, or a balloon and a bottle, I should say. Breathing out. The diaphragm relaxes. Your muscles on the inside of your rib cage will push down in order to reduce the volume. So same amount of air, smaller volume means a higher pressure, and out goes the air. Some important measurements here are VO2, which is just the rate at which which oxygen is used in the body. So right now I'm not using a lot of oxygen because I'm just sitting here making this video. But VO2 max is the maximum amount that you can use. And because oxygen is used to make lots and lots of energy, to convert lots of chemical energy to ATP, that is a very important measurement for athletes. They want to have a high VO2 max so that they can get as much oxygen to their body as possible so that their cells can do a lot of work in the same amount of time. Yeah, these are measured in milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body mass. So it's like a relative measure. If you're bigger and you have bigger lungs, like big tall people, they have bigger lungs just because they're bigger. They're gonna have more volume, but it's a comparative thing, so it's per kilogram of body mass. So, someone really, really tall might have less lung function, relative lung function, than someone very short that does like cycle racing or something like that. Yeah, I think that's it for respiration. No, it's not. Lung capacity. So lung capacity is based on lifestyle and activity. Your lungs get better and better at inhalation and exhalation and gas exchange based on exercise or lack thereof. So your body doesn't want to spend resources on things that it's not using. So if you don't use your lungs, if you don't give your lungs a workout, just like your muscles, it's going to shrink because your body doesn't want to use energy maintaining something that you're not using. Which is why aerobic exercise, high intensity exercise is recommended by the doctors in Canada, at least a little bit every day. Yeah. Athletes have a very high capacity compared to normal people, to sedentary people. Smokers have much lower lung capacity, so we'll talk about what smoking does to lung capacity a bit later in this note when we talk about diseases. Here's a graph. What you see here is volume, and you see the normal breaths here. What happened here? All right, what happened here? Normal breaths. Here, the person breathed in. Right, the volume of air in the lungs got very, very, very big. From a normal like 30, 37. My meeting is done. Sorry about that. From a normal 37 to 30, it went up to 80. It doubled. The lung volume doubled. So that's a big breath in. And then on the way down, right, it went past this bottom, it was past this bottom line and all the way out, right? So this means that the person tried to exhale as fully as possible. So here I am talking normally, and I'm just breathing normally while I'm talking. But, I have to take a breath every so often. But if I really try, I can just keep on talking about this graph without taking another breath in because I've got some extra volume here in my lungs that I can use. And I'm still using that same volume. I'm still breathing out. It's getting harder and harder because I have to compress all my muscles harder and harder and harder. And I'm going to have to take a breath in right about now. A big one. Because I went past the normal volume of my lungs, went down into my reserve capacity, extra air that's just around there. But that still meant I had air in my lungs. The reason for that is up here, and they keep in mind, alveoli are delicate and they need a little bit of air to stay open. That helps them stay open. And then you just go back to normal breathing. So here's what these things are called, and we're going to go through each one in the slides after this, but this is called tidal volume, just the normal breathing in and out. Tidal volume, just like the tides, they come in, they come out, they come in, they come out. Tidal volume. The big deep breath in, you've got extra capacity on an in breath, even if you've already taken a breath in. So like, I can take a normal breath in and take even more of a breath in after. That's called the inspiratory reserve volume. So inspiratory means breathe in, inspiration. Reserve means extra, and volume for volume. So you've got extra room to breathe in. On the other side, you've got expiratory reserve volume, so the extra room to breathe out. And together, the top to the bottom of all of the air you can possibly cycle through your lungs in one massive breath is called the vital capacity. Vital capacity. So from a full breath in to a full breath out, that's your vital capacity. And for most people, it's somewhere between 3 and 5 liters. 3 and 5 liters of air. Then this part here is residual volume, which is there's air that's always in the lungs. Always needs a little bit of air in the lungs. That keeps the alveoli open because if they collapse, then they're kind of like a deflated balloon. It's very hard to exchange air to get more air back in there. So yeah, that's your total lung capacity, but there's always that little bit of reserve volume in a normal functioning lung. So total, we talked about tidal volume, a little tidal volume thing. Inspiratory reserve is from what your normal, like, breathe in to how much you can possibly breathe in. Expiratory reserve is how much extra you keep in your lungs just normally. That creates the vital capacity from top to bottom. And the residual volume is just that little bit that always stays in the air, can't be exhaled. So even if you take a full breath out, there's still air in your lungs. That stops the lungs from collapsing. All right, now some diseases. So I'm going to pause. Okay, here's the last section here, and that's lung diseases. To keep in mind is that these tubes are tough and protected on the outside, like my trachea here. It's tough and protected, but on the inside it's actually quite sensitive because theoretically only gas is supposed to go up and down through it. Laryngeal cancer, the larynx, if you remember, is the voice box. So that's up above the trachea. If you get cancer there, typically they'll just remove it. That's called a laryngectomy. And they have to leave a hole there because now you don't have that connection between the mouth and the lungs. And they can do that. It's called a tracheectomy. And the trachea just is attached right there. You might have seen like dramatic videos of people like stabbing a pen in there to open up a hole to make a stoma. That is exceedingly rare. Please don't do that when someone's choking. Just call 911. Don't try to stab someone with a pen. Unless you are a trained medical professional, then maybe you can stab someone with a pen. Most common cause of the laryngeal cancer is smoking. Smoking has all kinds of terrible, terrible chemicals in it that mess up your DNA, and messed up DNA causes mutations, and some mutations can cause cancer, as you guys know very well from the genetics unit that we just did. This lady has a hole there. And when the hole is there, the voice box sits above it. The vocal cords and stuff are part of the larynx. So these people lose their vocal cords. They have to talk with a special device that takes their muscle movements and converts it into speech and stuff like that. So there's a video here. I'll link that video down in the description. So always videos are down there. That's laryngeal cancer. Next up, talking about the pleural membrane. Your lungs are actually covered in this shrink wrap. Is the best way to talk about it. It's a very thin membrane. It's covering the outside of the lungs. Because the lungs are always moving compared to the ribs, that protects them from, rubbing against the ribs. Kind of like the membrane around the heart, the pericardium, protects the heart. But that membrane is separate from the lungs. Normally it's stuck right there, but if you think about shrink wrap, if you get a little bit of air under the shrink wrap, the rest of the shrink wrap kind of comes off a lot easier. Same thing happens here. If air gets in there, the lungs start pumping air into the pleural cavity. And so the air pressure that you're normally using to breathe in and out, it actually starts collapsing the lung. That's called pneumothorax. And in order to alleviate this, they actually have to take punch a hole through the other side, so that at the very least the lung won't collapse from the pressure buildup, and it'll at least stay healthy enough for them to fix the pleural cavity issue. So there's a video here of a paramedic training where they show how to do one of these, and it's just a giant needle that they stab in through the rib cage to get an equalization of pressure between the two. Last piece, nicotine and the lungs, and note that the cancer comes from smoking, lots of carcinogens in smoke. Vaping though, vaping also has nicotine in it, so this isn't just smoking, this is vaping too. Nicotine will irritate these tubes because they're delicate on the inside, and the irritation creates more mucus because the lungs figure that they're under attack. It also reduces the amount of cilia, those little hairs that sweep stuff out of the way. So you've got more mucus and less ability to sweep that mucus out of the way. You're going to end up with reduced tube size and reduced lung function, whether you're smoking or vaping. There's also the other chemicals in smoke and in vape juice that will irritate the lungs, like the glycol in the vape juice, and obviously the smoke in smoke. Also a link between nicotine and heart disease. Nicotine will also constrict and stiffen blood vessels because it is a neuroactive chemical. It acts on muscle tissue, and the muscle tissue will constrict, and over time it'll actually get stiff. And you want your arteries and your veins and stuff to be more flexible, because that way they'll pulse with the blood pressure and stuff like that. When they're not, it can promote heart disease. Stuff can get stuck in the stiffer tubes compared to the flexible tubes. And so, fat can gather and you can end up with a heart attack from smoking. Very, very comorbid smoking. And I guess vaping too, but we probably don't have enough long-term exposure data on the nicotine in vapes on blood vessels, but I'm willing to bet that it's going to be very similar. And that's it. Let's just review what we talked about. Talked about our respiratory system overview. Talked about the structures of the lung. We did some breathing terms like inspiratory reserve, expiratory reserve, tidal volume, vital capacity, and VO2. And then just some basic disorders of the respiratory system, including, potential health effects of vaping in a few decades from all of the nicotine exposure that people are subjecting themselves to. Who knows? That's it for me, and I'll see you guys in class. Thanks for watching.